Okay, so here we are at a another, like we said, the weekly installment of the Kubernetes SIG. So John, where did we leave off last time?
One of the big areas we were discussing was a document that I had started around storage, so for persistent volumes as well as logs. And there were some things that weren't fully baked, and so I mentioned that I wanted to spend some time thinking about it and come back to it. So that's I think the big spot. And then I also, in order to just kind of keep things moving forward, wanted to pick another area to start talking about. And there's a doc that I posted on the ASF Slack for Cassandra configuration. It's an initial early rough draft.
Okay.
So I'd like to pick up with first with the discussion around storage. I will share my screen. I spent some time thinking about that and revising the document. I think, well, I think I have it written down somewhere. Okay, so here's the doc. There's some minor just changes initially. I put some just to clean it up a little bit, some background. I won't spend time on that. You can go back and look at it if you're interested. But what I've considered the broad goal is the operator should provide sane out-of-the-box defaults for configuring volumes for your persistence, and then for other persistence, namely for those files under varlib Cassandra, and then should provide some sane defaults for other files that I've categorized as log files. There's a couple of things that I would lump in there that aren't necessarily log files or application logs, like heap dumps, or if you need to run a profiler output, but in that same category. And that if you lose that data, it's not going to affect running Cassandra. So the operator on the one hand want to provide sane, reasonable defaults for those, configuring your persistent data, and then the other, like I said, calling it log data, but then giving the users the flexibility to configure things as necessary. The example that I think I started with last week was, I want to put my commit log on a separate volume. The operator / CRD should make that possible. Similarly, I want to expose my log files in order to integration with a logging sidecar for doing some further analysis. So let me go down. So the sections I have here are the same as last week with respect to the examples of CAS operator and CASCOP. And that was what got me started thinking that they do the same thing with respect to configuring the logging sidecar in terms of what the end result. CAS operator just doesn't expose it in the spec. CASCOP does. And so I kind of had spent a bunch of time thinking about that. And so let me go down to what I came up with in terms of the types. So I introduced two types: one, persistent data, and log data. And then in short, persistent data ultimately would map to a persistent volume, and the log data maps to, more generally, a volume, and then also with potentially a logging sidecar. So you have the fields here for specifying in both of these types, both of these structs, the volume name, the name of the, I'm sorry, for the name of the volume mount, the path. For the persistent data, you have one of the things I saw with, so I was trying to build off ideas in both the CAS operator and CASCOP. In CAS operator, I'm sorry, in CASCOP, you could, for the data volume varlib Cassandra, the persistent volume claim is not directly exposed. Instead, there's properties for specifying the capacity and the storage class, which is nice on the one hand because it's provides a nice abstraction. If all I care about, particularly if I'm just getting started and I just want to spin something out quickly and say, well, I need a 10 gigabit volume and with SSD storage, and I'm done. Don't have to worry about the volume content. On the other hand, if I know a little bit more, I have a little bit more requirements and want to have the flexibility, it's nice with CAS operator where the volume claim template is, you have it fully at your disposal to fully configure. So both of those ideas are incorporated here, trying to have the flexibility and ease of use. With the log data structs.
Hey, John, sorry.
Sure.
Quick point of clarification. So would there be a separate persistent data for like the commit log and one for the data and one for caches and that sort of thing? Or would persistent data be like the top level data directory and everything is underneath that?
So I'll answer. So let me scroll down. I'll come back to log data and I'll answer that since you raised the question.
Okay.
So I've got another type
right
here.
Okay, that makes sense.
The storage config, and so let me go. So you'll see there's the. Let me start with you have this Cassandra data dir. And that would corresponds to varlib Cassandra. So on the one hand, I'm striving for providing maximum flexibility, where to allow somebody to specify as minimal information as possible, while also being able to giving them maximum configuration, maximum configurability, if that's a word. So by default, the operator, if nothing is else, so we'll notice these are all pointers. So if nothing is specified, well, that the operator by default would initialize this field, the Cassandra data dir, to what the operators basically do today. I say the operators, whether you're talking CAS operator, at this point, not too concerned with the implementation. So whether it's the way CAS operator sets up the persistent volume, or the way CASCOP, or something, or the way InstaCluster, or something in between. It's just there's a default, your default. You don't do anything else. And then if you want to configure the default, there you can. I was chatting with Jim, and he pointed out to me, chatting with Jim over the weekend, and he pointed out the need. We do at a minimum need to specify a storage class. So I added a default storage class that if you just want to use, so that we could be used globally for the volumes, or it could be overridden for each of these fields if you wanted. And so to your question, now if I want to, for the use case of, I want to put my commit log on a separate volume, so how do I do that? I could initialize this commit log dir property with the necessary information. So I have an example. I think I do. I hope I do. Okay, so no, let's say we don't want to do that. Let's say we want to put the CDC. We want to use the change data capture, and we want to put the CDC commit log on a separate volume. And so here I initialize the CDC raw dir property, and I'm only specifying the name of the volume, the path, capacity, and storage class. But again, you could also set the, let's go back up. the full volume claim template, so to more explicitly initial or fully initially and explicitly and fully initialize it and override it. And then so if I did that, then the operator should look at that and say, no, that it's basic, no to, you still use the default data directory except for the CDC raw directory, and put and create the separate volume for it, and then do the same for each of the persistent data directories. For and then the another thing I don't think I listed in here, and then the operator, I think you could do some validation checks to make sure that the mount points, you don't have overlapping mount points, so that if there's any problems, you find those out earlier, rather than deploy things and see, hey, wait a minute, where's my directory. So with the log data, so I'll talk about the first property here, the sidecar enabled. So Cyril in the last meeting spent some time talking about with the logging sidecars that they have, and again, CAS operator does the same thing. It's just it's not exposed in the manifest, and so think, well, that's. And I think, well, gosh, and I spent some time, I think Ben, there's some good discussion around logging in general, and I thought, well, it'd be nice to be able to simply have a flag. I could say, well, for this particular log file, I'd like that sidecar so that I can use standard tooling for accessing logs. And when I say standard tooling, kubectl in particular, I think I mentioned, the ideal, the most robust logging solution is going to be some sort of whether it's ELK, or if you like GK, or if you like Stackdriver and GKE, with some centralized logging. But if I want to be able to use the tools available with your kubectl, then the logging sidecar makes that the easiest way to do that. So, and then, so the name and the mount path we've already discussed. The volume source here is, and that's a pointer. Again, so to provide the flexibility, let's say, so if I want, again, well, not just, well, I need to be able to, I'm gonna have to mount the volume to make it, mount the log files in a volume that's accessible to other sidecar, whether it's the log sidecar or something else that I might want to make accessible. That volume source, that could be a persistent, it could be a any supported volume source. So you're not limited there. And similar to with the persistent data, explicitly, where is it? Oh, here it is. There's the Cassandra logdir property, which just is the default var log Cassandra, and whatever, and that would, if in the absence of any other properties being set, then the operator would, my thinking is the operator would initialize this to the default settings. And again, for the purposes of where we are at today with the discussions, that's more implementation. I'm thinking about design, so it's whatever the decision is around what those defaults should be. So I think today, for example, I know with CAS operator, the system log is set up out of the box with the logging sidecar, So maybe we want that. And then let's say I want to, what did I provide as an example? And I wanted to expose the Cassandra debug log. So here's an example of how I configured the debug log and mounted that to an empty dir volume, so that maybe I could do some additional processing on it. And then if I wanted to, then I could set the sidecar enabled flag to true if I wanted to have the a logging sidecar for it. And part of another motivation I was thinking about with with how I kind of structured this is, in one of my first experiences, which was with using Cassandra and Kubernetes, which was going back in Kubernetes years a while, it was pre-stateful sets, and things were a bit rough in terms of understanding of things and how to set things up and configure them. It ran into issues with, it was a struggle. There were times we're trying to diagnose problems, and let's say the Cassandra node was crashing with out-of-memory errors, and asked, can we get a heap dump? And we had very little ways of configuring things so that we could put the heap dump somewhere so we wouldn't lose them when the pod was killed. And that was critical to try to troubleshoot the problems. And so, it was kind of like playing whack-a-mole, trying to get a hold of files, before they disappeared. So wanting to provide that flexibility for those situations where we're doing any kind of maintenance and operations. And then I have the last property. So, before I get to the last property, there may be other maybe there are other files or directories that would make sense to add or remove. It was just, so this is not necessarily meant to be, maybe doesn't cover everything, but just kind of convey wanted to provide enough to convey the approach, the idea.
This was probably the controversial thing from last meeting, was the whole log directory. And how many other operators handle log directories? Like, I'm just curious, like, what's the current state of the art?
I've not seen any. I think the common practice I've seen is really everything just logs to standard out. And if you want to do any sort of centralized logging with anything,
you're on your own.
Capture, send it out, and ship it off somewhere.
Well, so the one of the things I think was discussed, the problem is you've got multiple log files. So
yeah,
that's where you need this. If you want to capture the debug logs, if you want the GC logs,
slow query
simply
log,
doing it in one container doesn't work. That's why you need the logging site.
Yeah, no, yeah. I'm not disagreeing with the approach. I'm just saying kind of what I've seen. Couchbase is similar. Couchbase has a ton of different logs because there's a ton of different daemons that are all running together. And one thing we do is in our image for that, we basically cat them all out to standard out, basically the ones that we want. And so we're just kind of like piping them all, just so we can, because we do ship everything out to a centralized, in our case it's Datadog, but we centralize all of our logs.
So this is like one of those, this is what I was trying to chime in and say, this is like one of those places where Cassandra itself is not very friendly. So like the way you described Couchbase doing that sounds like they have like sort of the minimum bar hit, but all these decisions start to run together. So what happens is we have, in the Cass operator, we use the management API. So the management API owns standard out, and we were debating what to do with that. It's like, do we like pass standard out down and then like kind of don't know which process some of the logs came from exactly, and it just started to get confusing. So yeah, so if you don't enable some minimum config, you can't even start those sidecar containers, because you at the least have to set up like the empty dir volume that like all your sidecar containers can share, and drop the logs there. But yeah, if Cassandra, I don't know how Cassandra could change that much. Like just writing a standard out is pretty good, but it's sort of like,
well, the logback XML file, I mean, this is what I hate this answer, but it's like that the portability, the configurability is kind of built into just how Java does logging. Like if you need to dump it into a syslog directory or a syslog server, you can do that if you want to. And actually, I think this is how Datadog works, as a matter of fact. Splunk has a listener, so think of places where people collect log files, was it Logstash, or they put it in their ELK, or it goes into Splunk, whatever. This is like not an uncommon problem. And, as I talk to majority of operators out there, this is one of the things that it's like a top problem is, and John, I know you do a lot of consulting in the open source side. It's like, what do we do with our logs? Because unfortunately, most of the bad things that happen show up in the logs first. And they got to pay attention to them. So just saying, well, we'll dump it into a ephemeral directory on a container just doesn't seem like a good idea.
I'm not sure. Well, I think so. The way my kind of view of the world is, let's say you don't do anything and you just have varlog Cassandra, and that's kind of like the doing the least amount of work to do anything to improve logging. So you've got to use commands, maybe with kubectl exec, to copy the log files out of the container, which is certainly not great. But
yeah,
if it's not going to standard out, if it's going to standard out,
yeah,
more. But and I'm not sure. Like the kubelet does store like the current logs, and I'm not sure if for how long or how much. I guess it's a kubelet level configuration. But then, as well as it stores, if the container is restarted, it'll contain the last set of logs as well. Mm-hmm. So that's better than just the out of the box. A little bit better. Then, of course, sending your logs to a logging, like you said, Datadog or ELK, certainly going to be a much more robust solution.
I think this is one of those things that, John and I were talking about this earlier, but just to kind of surface that conversation, is there, as we're going further, we have a lot of activity that's already happened around Cassandra and Kubernetes, but it's almost like we're looking at looking at all the technical debt that's accumulated. One of the things that I think is really important to recognize is the fact that there's really been very little talked about in changing Cassandra. And this is a good example. Cassandra logging facilities were pretty much baked back in 2010, 10 years ago. This has not changed a bit. And that's back when I used like Splunk to dump all my Cassandra logs. And I think that's just something that we need to think about from a project standpoint, from a Cassandra project standpoint, is what needs to modernize in the way that it logs. New facilities, and this is a change that maybe needs to happen on Cassandra's side. Controversial statement. Crickets. Okay.
No, well, I think that
I don't think syslog is the way of the future. like there's nothing Kubernetes is really that I've seen is pushing that way. Maybe that's a bold statement, but
Yeah, what is the state of the art for Kubernetes log management?
so yeah, it would be like, why do you need all this? Like, just write the standard out and set up your logging infrastructure with your Kubernetes. So I think it's really that it's like, why is there system log and a debug log and then you've got the Java stuff underneath? It's like, could we make something that like scoops those Java logging events into the Cassandra log? Like, try to unify up these streams. Maybe they should be, maybe it's better treatment of standard out versus standard error. I think Kubernetes offers some pretty good support for that. And like I said, there are other sort of I don't want to say older necessarily bad, but there's other stuff that was like invented well pre-Kubernetes that's adapted a little bit. Like if you just look at the standard Nginx container, like they've adapted access log and error log to fit. So it makes me think it could be done.
Yeah.
I guess kind of a product concern, but I'll mention it because it came up, was also the occasions when maybe sensitive data gets logged, and I don't know how other databases are handling that. Probably not that differently. I mean, I know MySQL really well, and if you're put somebody's social security number in a unique key and you insert it twice, you get a unique, like the log's clearly printed out. It's like, unique key violation, it'll print it out. But I know that's something we've been concerned about. And that's sort of another logging subject. But I think just better, making it so this isn't necessary would be a nice thing to get upstream in Cassandra. So it's just like, hey, maybe Cassandra does more like at the more systems level to like get those GC logs and JVM logs kind of sucked into some kind of standard error configurably, and then there's no need for system log and debug log. It's just like set your log level with an environment variable, and then you get whichever level flowing the standard out. That's it.
I think it's funny that we haven't, it's like almost like as an entire ecosystem, people who run infrastructure, we really haven't moved on from logging as what it is. I mean, syslog is still kind of the way that it works, even though you have agents like Datadog,
Right.
ELK, Splunk. But syslog is really that. But I guess maybe we don't need much more.
The
It just
spirit
needs to be
hasn't
modernized.
changed. I agree with you.
Yeah, here's a log level and a message. Like, what else do you want? It's a key value. We're not even a key value. It's a value. But yeah, I'd be willing. I think this would be a really interesting discuss on the dev mailing list of modernizing logging inside of Cassandra and just let that go where it goes. Sorry to derail, but this is one that just struck me.
No, I think it's a great idea. However, seeing how some discussions on the dev mailing list seem like they turn into long chapter books, be good to make sure, like, have a solid some ideas to at least set the tone for the conversation versus just being open-ended. Whether it's, hey, like to see logging changes and we'd like to see these changes. Here's a bullet point list for to better support Kubernetes use cases.
So don't start it with discuss. Logging sucks. Fix it, and just leave it like that.
Right, because maybe somebody comes up with a great solution, but it's not great for Kubernetes, or maybe the discussion spirals into, and then it's like years later.
It's like a dev list discussion can. It's like
yes, yeah. And then 2.5 years later, like, oh wow, we're not done discussing it.
It started with logging sucks and it ended with yo mama. Okay.
And then somebody comes up with an idea for Kubernetes and we're like, we're not using Kubernetes anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
We're on to the next thing. Yeah.
Moved on. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all right. I just to kind of put a cap on that, then I think that's something that we need to consider. Like, what's the opinionation of the old Kubernetes, the new Kubernetes posse rolling into town about logging? Like, what kind of changes would be done to Cassandra to make it more friendly in that regard? I'll just leave it at that.
All right. So I have some notes, and I can, and if anybody, well, yeah, try to keep this, the Slack channel active. Any thoughts on there? I'll make a point to keep monitoring that around on the logging or anything for me to look at. I'm happy to try to drive or consolidate information discussion as much as I can. And so with that, I'll switch gears to configuration. Let me go up.
Just want to say this is all great, John. Thanks for driving all of this. This is great work.
You're welcome. Like I said, yeah, I'm glad to be involved. It's learning a lot. Okay. This is specifically focused on Cassandra configuration, not on the Kubernetes side of things. So we're not talking labels or pod resource configuration, about Cassandra itself. And so I just dumped the list of the config files that Cassandra ships with. I'm not sure if that covers all of them, or at least for like 3.11. And with a very brief description of each. And then, so the goals, so stateful sets, I think one of the things that the areas where they're kind of come up short is around configuration. Stateful sets provide a way to configure persistent volumes for the pods that make up that stateful set, but they don't provide any such or similar construct or mechanism for config files. So that seems like a gap. And so some prior meeting when we were going through looking at examples of specs for the different operators, we were looking at how we looked at an example of how InstaCluster allows you to configure settings, an example of how Cascop, and then also with CAS operator. And there's a lot of really, and because it's left out for stateful sets, people have to come up with some really innovative approaches for doing things. And I didn't repeat prior examples. This, like I said, this is an early drafted, but I do have an example from CAS operator, because I think that CAS operator kind of really hits the nail on the head with respect to what the end user should see. Or I have in here the, let's see, I think a goal, when I think of, if I'm running Cassandra outside of Kubernetes and I need to update I need to provision Cassandra, I simply, whether it's by hand in VI or using whatever tools, Puppet, Chef, Ansible, or whatever the case may be, I can simply, however I need to do it, edit and update my config files. Of course, that's not the way the world works in Kubernetes. So that's the ideal on the one hand. And CAS operator gets us really close to that with the CRD, where you can see here, where you just simply almost a one-to-one mapping of property names from Cassandra, from the YAML file, for example, from the Cassandra YAML. So I asked Jim, and then you also see the JVM options listed. So I asked Jim if he would spend a few minutes just giving some more background on what CAS operator does around this. I will pass the baton over to Jim.
Hey there. Okay. So where to start with this? Okay. So I guess as we debated this around and around, we decided that having the config be exposed in the custom resource directly would be the most user-friendly thing. So there's no, we thought, and in some ways I still think there's some merit to using config maps for this, but it's just sort of another, while it's probably better for some cases, it's definitely like a much bigger barrier to entry, and makes reconciling things a little trickier, and it's just another point where things can fail, right? So if we're pushing down the config, config maps, it's slightly more robust than config maps, which are ultimately eventually consistent at the end of the day. So how do you want the config maps? Like if you're changing the seeds and then you want to like go and say, hey, the seeds are updated, like you need to start building a lot of stuff to figure out if your config map is updated. And most of these services in Kubernetes, which I'm sure probably most people here know, but it's fine if not, like there's a bunch of operators that just deal with this one problem of like, hey, when should I bounce my pods to make sure they get new config maps or what have you, which we don't want to do. We don't want to get into that. We can't restart a node necessarily to get some of the simplest config changes that are read on the fly. Maybe especially seeds to be considered here. So anyway, so we started from there and we built down and we said, hey, let's just kind of expose the values where they are. This means like all the Cassandra documentation is also documentation basically for this dialect or whatever of the configuration. Like we're not, there's a couple things in here that they're shortenings, especially as you get outside of Cassandra YAML, but largely, you know, it corresponds directly to the same files from upstream. So if you discover an answer for, you know, vanilla Cassandra tarball on your laptop, your answer will apply here, and you can easily check that. What else? So some of the glue of how this is assembled is there's a init container that fires, so the operator passes this data plus some other stuff like the data center name and rack name. We're not requiring, like, there are values that the operator knows how to push down per rack, and we pass that all via environment variables to the init container, and the init container comes up, reads that, uses a bunch of other, so this was like I mentioned in a previous one of these calls, we have a lot of code around this aspect of starting the database, so we repurpose some of it. And so we say, oh, we know the exact version of Cassandra you're on, we know what the defaults are, so we render out the full defaults as like a template, and then we push this down as more template data. I think that could all be simplified. I wouldn't necessarily judge what we have based on reading all the source and being like, this is exactly how I would implement it. It's more of like, but do you think the API is good? Do you think the spirit of how it works is good? And yeah, I would be happy to kind of push it more towards a cloud native source, maybe just Kubernetes native approach where this part could be done with Go and maybe with less templating and more simple like YAML parsing. But anyway, I'm not sure exactly what you wanted, John, but that's kind of how we arrived where we're at. And I'll say using this component a lot from Astra, like our product, it's very nice how things just sort of can pass down through multiple levels. So I'm like, oh yeah, I don't have to like punch holes through like different APIs to make like, I like what Cascov has, the spirit of how simple it is to just said some things together. But the first time you need to like specify a thing that there's no kind of placeholders in the sed scripts for, like you're back to hacking. You're not really a user anymore. You have to become a developer. Whereas this, I think we can keep people firmly in their user seat and say, hey, I know there's this JVM arg I want applied. I know there's this -d Cassandra parameter I want applied. And like, I just put it in that additional JVM ops and it just sails through a bunch of layers and I can stay firmly in my like just reading the docs and changing the config mindset.
Yeah, I mean, one point to make about this versus the said, type of thing is like, this is declarative, right? When you're looking at said things, it's by definition procedural, right? Which is kind of at odds with Kubernetes.
Totally. Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. The more we're pushing more and more configuration to declarative as well for our stuff. It's bubbling through Astra, but it's bubbling through the operator as well. So like if you look at Cass operator, we just merged something. We're gonna cut a release today. I need to get off the call and finish it, but we're letting users declare their Cassandra users specify their Cassandra users declaratively. And we want to get key spaces coming and grants in there too. So more and more of your like test harness can just be like, this is how it should be. And then you don't really have to make sure it's so. Maybe you don't have to like worry about when the server is up to apply. It's just more stuff, more glue that, the developers don't need to worry about.
Yeah, I need to update the goals here I think I could have summarized what I have here to say is make it declarative. And that would suffice for the goal. And the background that was really helpful, Jim. And it's so. Oh, I did put some questions as I was kind of thinking through. So are there properties that shouldn't be allowed to set here? For example, like ports. And what happens today in CAS operator if somebody decides to go in there and change the values for their the CQL port or the GUS?
Some ports you can probably change without harm. In general, yeah, I want to just block all that. We're in Kubernetes. There's no sense of you like micromanage unless someone can show me a great example of when it's useful. Maybe under certain security constraints or whatever, there's a good reason. But I mean, we're not binding to ports under 1,000. I think there's some restrictions, even though you can just do that kind of freely in a container. Some of these runtimes make that prohibited, but yeah, in general, there's plenty of places where you could like try to overthink this and just break everything. Like I think we were chatting, John, and I said like if you use the initial tokens, like good luck. I don't think it will work. Like we should blacklist or deny, reject certain thing. Like things that just why are you doing this?
Right.
I have some outstanding stuff for validation that we haven't gotten to, but my approach would just be like we have the validating webhook, so we could just read through your config chain and I wouldn't be too overly prescriptive about it, but say pick out the top 10 or 12 people are likely to start fussing with and then block those. But there'll probably always be more, and we can just fix it with tickets or just document and say you might hit this. Yeah, there's a million little file paths and ports and stuff that I don't think should be allowed to be reconfigured because you're kind of handing off, I don't know, somewhere between half and 2/3 of the configuration work, right, to the operator.
Right. And that brings up another question. Are there parts of the configuration that should be made? Does it make sense to make them more, or you're more explicit, or make them more prominent in the spec? And I gave it as an example, and maybe this isn't the best example, it's one that I thought of based on what was here. Like, should there be an auth property? Like I know I was looking at like the Postgres one of the Postgres operators has a auth property section for configuring whatever auth related settings it allows you to configure. So that was the other question I had. Like, I don't know, are there certain properties that makes more sense that should be called out more explicitly?
Yeah, so we have a couple of those. They're just not in these examples, but like specifying the garbage collector is kind of a complicated mess of like 1 or 2 or 3 JVM args. We need to put up better docs for that, but yeah, so like things like that do get abstracted into something more like what you see under JVM options there, where it's like we're writing out max heap size. You can also use -x mx, but I think probably better for some of these. I don't know. It's tricky. I think that just needs to be better documented personally. Yeah, you don't have to use those nicely named ones, but I find it a little easier to read. The SH and bash scripts that start Cassandra are aware. And yeah, so I need to look at the scripts that the config builder emits out for Cassandra. I'm pretty sure they're exactly the same as upstream because we just kind of take the upstream stuff and insert some templating placeholders into it, but I would probably want to double check that. I look at DSE a little more often, but about half and half.
And then I don't have the question here, but similar to the that question that Patrick raised around the logging, is there anything that could be done upstream in Cassandra that would make things?
I think Umair said it last time. More stuff that just is regular environment very like yeah. If there's just too many files, too many different formats, too many scripts, like all of this just needs to be simplified and standardized. If it was up to me, I would say there should be like one Go binary that reads one YAML file and the environment, and then kicks off and then execs the JVM, and it's not, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I never thought about it because I don't know why, but like, why couldn't the JVM options file just simply be incorporated into the main config file?
Some of it's reused for the tools, right? So like node tool and not CQLSH. At least node tool, but I think and all the SS table manipulating things use those files too. So I understand the purpose of why it's chopped up so much, but I don't know. I came in to working at Daystax completely new to Cassandra, and I'm just like, I think I got to this with fresh eyes, and I'm like, this is challenging. I can understand why working on an operator is a big value add for all the Kubernetes administrators out there.
All right. Well, that covers everything that I have for today. We're wrapping it up, get close to the top of the hour. I will do some little more investigation on research on the logging, the state of the art for logging, and then since we had a smaller audience today, try to get some more eyes on this and some feedback and see what folks think.
So what's the next step here? So we meet again next Thursday. What do we want to bring then, and what are we going to discuss? I feel like we're at the end. I mean, so you're at the end of discussing configuration, and now we're starting to talk about, okay, now what do we do? And now what?
There's other areas of the as far as the spec you go through, but I mean we've talked about topology, we've talked about storage, or at least enough. There's enough that we just looked at that if we can, or I think it's probably worth iterating on just those areas to say, and then can we move it further along on those areas and say, well, start talking some code drops.
I think that's where a lot of folks want to be right now. What do we need to do to get some code drops? Let's start talking about what that looks like.
Yeah, I think you know, it keeps being questioned each week, but I think the volume stuff has been the best example of why we need to try to combine our resources and not just say, oh, let's just start with somebody's code that we already have. Because I know the parts I think from Cass Operator are great, and I told John, I'm like, well, volumes is not our strong point. I know why we have it so simplified, but
right,
you know,
yeah, this has to
what John
appeal
had,
a
yeah,
lot
what John,
to many users.
yeah, what John has here is like a way more fully specified thing that's sort of like, it'll be tedious to program up, but it will pay off. That, you know, everybody's use case that's pretty valid can be hit by this versus like, and I'll say, like, we used to have some different stuff for volumes and it was very confusing, and that's why we simplified it. And that's why I was also like, you know, be careful. If you don't match existing Kubernetes stuff like very closely, then it creates confusion because you're not letting people use their muscle memory that they got from defining all their other Kubernetes resources.
Right. Well, okay. So I think that's where we're going to be next time. John, again, appreciate all the effort you're putting out here. This has been really good.
Yeah, thanks, John.
Another question, I guess, related to on the topic of code drops is, I guess there needs to be discussion on tooling. For example, like we're going to use Operator SDK, Kube Builder, you know, the stack, I guess, you know, for, yeah, that's maybe things that probably need to be sorted out, or is that just
pretty important implementation detail?
yeah. I mean,
so we're like a little past a year after where we started, and I think it's still, I know we had some folks who work on Kudo come to these calls once or twice before. I have to drop pretty much right on the hour, but anyway, I think
I'm here. Yeah, sorry, I was listening.
Oh, that was you. Okay, I thought so. I wasn't 100% sure, but yeah, I was looking at some Kudo stuff and actually noticed how you guys were doing backup. So I think there's something to, you know, consider there, and think just how all this stuff ends up happening.
Yeah, no, sorry, like I didn't talk during the John, great stuff. I have to say that, like, I'm not able to join, unfortunately, on the Thursday sync. So today I got the opportunity, and yeah, like I would say, yeah, like these are like implementation details, and I would really like to help there also. But one thing that I think we can already start is like, I would like to add to the agenda is some days for some sort of testing or conformance testing, right? So where we say like, hey, yeah, this is the operator, and we say this is like ready for, you know, like some scoreboard that the, you know, like the community has set up for the Cassandra operators, and it has to pass, and we can, you know, like work on some standardizing that one. But yeah, like on other parts, yeah, like I'm also like, it's especially like today what you present is like really great stuff, and later I will comment on that. Like, for I have some question on the storage and for logging, but yeah, like I don't have still all the background there.
Yeah, maybe we should cover tests at another, just how each operator does testing. I'm sorry, I really got to drop though, but
yeah,
thanks again, John, and thanks, Patrick. Thanks everybody for coming. These are really helpful.
I feel like we're making progress. Thanks, Jim. All right, I know everyone, it's the top of the hour. So again, we're going to be meeting next week. I'm looking at the schedule. It will be later. I think we rotate back later. So it's in the calendar. I will send a reminder. Here, I'll take a look real quick. Oh, it's not in there. So I need to go make sure that happens. It's not in the calendar. So I'm going to go add that right now. That's what needs to happen. Yeah, it should be, I'll figure out which time it should be. Anyhow, I will get back together. I think we're going to be doing it 10 a.m. Yeah, 10 a.m. this time, Pacific time. So it'll be the same time next week on Thursday, this time. Okay.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.